Hello, everyone, and welcome back to AR Insider Innovators. I'm your host, Mike Boland, and our guest today is Mike Festa, who's CTO of SuperDNA 3D Lab. So, Mike, welcome to the program.
Hey, Mike and everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, so we have a lot to cover, but before diving in, just for sort of context, tell us a little bit about your background and your role at SuperDNA 3D Lab for those unfamiliar.
Sure, absolutely. Well, yeah, so it's my pleasure to be here. I've been doing AR, VR, 3D stuff for the better part of a decade now. I really got to do this professionally for the first time when I was at Wayfair. We sell a lot of furniture, and I created a team called Wayfair Next. We were using like AR, this is back in like 2015, but we were using like emerging AR devices to project furniture into people's spaces, which is great because it could really help you understand how big that couch is going to be or will this table fit. After that, I started my own company, ran that for about 3 years called 3XR. We built a platform to help brands create and digitize 3D content. And that's when I actually really get to know and work with the SuperDNA team. For myself, my startup journey ended when we couldn't raise more funding. But SuperDNA has been around since 2017, producing 3D content, and it was a great fit for my kind of continued interest in this space. I'm also with the Kronos Group. I'm the vice chair for 3D Commerce, and that's a group of industry folks that have been fighting the good fight, trying to get 3D commerce up off the ground, working on things like standards and trying to make it so that if you create content one place for one platform, you can also take that same content and use it somewhere else to help spread out the ROI cost.
Yeah. Makes sense. And you're right, you are a veteran of the space and the current wave of like XR. It's funny, I was thinking about this the other day. It's been about a decade. The marker being when Meta or then Facebook bought Oculus. That was around 2014 and that really sort of
That's
kicked this
right.
current wave off. We're about 10 years into it. Isn't that crazy?
It is. It's yeah. The time passes fast, and you can probably see from my background. I've been doing this stuff for a while. I've got go all the way back to the original Oculus DK1, and
Nice.
then subsequently there were periods of rapid innovation too. Like 2016 was a big year when public VR started really taking off, and it's gone through the hype cycles, ups and downs. Apple Vision Pro this year, and it continues to evolve. I think we're still a little ways away from people wearing headsets all the time.
Yeah.
But it isn't, exciting to be part of that kind of new technology. And I think Meta's done a good job with the Quest 3 as far as making it more mass market, even if it's still a little bit more catered to the gaming industry.
Yep.
I think we'll see over time, there's going to be more and more use cases, e-commerce being one of them.
Yeah.
But even, absent of the progression of headsets and head-worn devices, we're seeing a lot of value in 3D content today
Yep.
in using it to create more of your traditional 2D content or video content. You can do configurators, you can do virtual try-on. So there's still a lot you can do even before we get to that world of tomorrow where 3D is going to become a requirement and not just like a nice thing to have.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that, mixed reality and pass-through AR in devices like Quest 3 and 3S really sets a standard for mixed
Mhm.
reality in VR. And I think by doing so, it's really going to broaden the use cases and also give AR just an ability to piggyback on that more established form factor, the more mature form factor of VR. So a lot going on there. And while we're still sort of giving some front end context here, you told us a lot about yourself, your background. If you could do the same about Super DNA 3D Lab itself, so what it does, what differentiates it, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, SuperDNA got its start in 2017, and the main focus of the company, for the most part of its existence, I'd say the first 6 years, have really been around content production and doing it at scale. We have quite a large team of in-house artists that are basically efficient. They're able to get requirements from the customer. And that could be just a website PDP page, right? You get your
Hmm.
product page and you get some public facing information. Our team's pretty talented. They can create a 3D model from scratch, usually with just that reference data. Of
Yeah.
course, we with CAD if it's available, or 3D scanning technology. But generally speaking, we've built out this fairly large army of content creators, and they're able to work through our tools and internal platform pretty efficiently, so we can offer competitive pricing in just model creation. And then I'd say in the last year, our main focus has been shifting more towards becoming a platform for managing that content and that production process, and then syndicating and distributing the content. So not only can you create the content with us, but you can also get the most value from that content by being able to, one click publish it to many different
Yeah.
destinations that, we work with through a lot of great partners out there.
Yeah, and it sounds like the theme there is really lowering friction and democratizing this technology because as we're gonna get into,
Mhm.
there is still a lot of sort of resistance and detriments in capability on the buy side. So really, it sounds like you're carrying forward that theme of just lowering the friction as much as possible for folks to adopt it. Now, so with that said, and like diving in, one of the sort of things we're going to do here today to stay focused is to talk about obviously 3D and AR's role in shopping, but we're going to zero in on the fashion industry due to its size, due to its sort of opportunity there. So, starting at a high level, tell us about the sort of particular attributes of fashion. Its culture of adoption, its products that make it particularly sort of relevant or primed for immersive shopping.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's really been interesting to see not only within the Super DNA business, but broadly, kind of through Kronos and our interactions with a lot of folks in the technology space, that we kind of found that there were a few waves of adoption. The initial one being more in that kind of furniture, home
Mm,
goods, large considered purchases. The AR experience helped you kind of fit it in a space and see how it might look. So that was a great kind of first round. What we've been seeing now with this kind of, I would call it a second wave, is a lot more interest in the fashion space. Things like virtual try on now are, technologies like you've probably seen in Snapchat, right? You can
mhm.
use your camera, see yourself, and then see a product on you. And so it adds this extra layer of personalization. It's not just seeing it in your room, but now it's seeing it as part of, your own brand and your own fashion. And so we found that, virtual try on with glasses, with shoes, watches, jewelry, these are all areas that are now, starting to explode. And we're seeing a lot of interest, especially from the high end kind of luxury brands. They're typically the ones that have the budget and the interest to adopt early for these types of technologies. And they're really interested in getting, one-to-one accurate digital twin of their product. So the quality is utmost importance. And, that's another reason that we feel like we've been able to get a lot of work in this space, because the team's kind of established and built up that expertise over the years as we've been working in this space previously, primarily I would say in the home goods and furniture space, and increasingly more and more seeing, fashion becoming the big new thing.
Yeah. So to sort of synthesize that for our audience, there are lots of sort of attributes that make a given product sort of align with the value that 3D models can bring. You mentioned a lot of them. So high consideration, right? Cost,
Mhm.
size, high reliance on physical appearance, obviously, variability, different colors, sizes, textures. I know you've done a lot of work with textures at Wayfair and elsewhere. And some of the other verticals we see a lot of those attributes map are autos, furniture you mentioned, and
Mhm.
fashion just
Yep.
to be primed for all of them based on its just highly visual nature. Now, another sort of ROI point that really can resonate with a lot of fashion brands is the cost savings when compared with the traditional methods of generating product imagery for e-commerce, and that mostly traditionally has involved digital photography. So break down for
Mhm.
us sort of a comparison in terms of the tangible financial benefits when talking about 3D models as opposed to that like very involved process of taking pictures of every angle and color and size.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And usually where I kind of start with this is thinking about the logistics required for, today's kind of traditional method. And when you think about, you need to fabricate the product. So if you're in pre-production, you have to wait until you've got something that is ready to be, sold. And a lot of times those prototypes need to get shared internally with different team members. So they're physically shipping samples to
Yeah.
different folks to review. They're physically manufacturing those samples. They're reviewing them and then eventually getting to a final product. That final product also has to be produced, shipped to a photo studio, packaged. If it's, fabric or, anything that has wrinkles potentially, has to be steamed and prepped,
Mm.
and, your lint brush and get all the little tiny little hairs out of there. So there's a lot of like work, like physical work that goes into the logistics of just getting the product and setting up the product to get the picture. And that's kind of the starting point. It's like, okay, now you get a digital picture. There's also a refinement, like touch up process that you typically do to, make the photo look beautiful. You can do a lot on site, on scene, but then if you want to be able to make that product have a different background or put it in a different environment, you can do it with Photoshop, right? So, but that's extra work on top. Versus the 3D process, it really starts with that kind of whatever you have. If you're designing in CAD internally, if you've got some reference 3D data, we can work with that. If you've got pictures of, design concepts or ideas or artwork, we can work from there as well. So you can really get your 3D renders and imagery done before the product's even made. So that's one. It saves you time and it gives you a little bit faster iteration if you're using this internally to change the things quickly based on feedback. And then of course once you're ready to actually put that out there and market it, you can generate all your 2D content from the 3D model as well. And then over different times or seasons, we saw this especially with furniture, right? If you were going to have Thanksgiving's coming up in the US here, so if you wanted to have something that was kind of interior fall themed, you'd put all your, if you were doing it traditionally, you'd have to assemble all that content, maybe rent a house, do a photo shoot, get it all done, in the right time. If you want the fall leaves, you got to wait till the leaves have turned. If you're doing this all digitally, though, you can reuse the products, mix and match them. You can change your, Thanksgiving holiday scene into a Christmas or a New Year's scene, and you're able to reuse those assets throughout the year as long as the product's kind of, in service. So we find that there's a lot more flexibility in just creating your, traditional content, let alone the ability to go beyond and then, try the product on or let the customer, kind of configure it or spin it around in the browser. So, generally from a cost saving standpoint, I think if we were to look at this the opposite, if you would say the established process was like the 3D workflow, and someone was coming to you and saying, hey, I've got this great idea. I'm going to create a physical warehouse. You're going to ship me your product when it's done. We're going to set it up. We're going to take pictures and we're going to do all this work. No one would go that opposite direction, right?
Right.
So I think if you compare the two, it's always hard to change, from one thing that's established to another thing. But when we look at the value and the progress, that the two offer to us who have been in the 3D industry for a while, it's kind of a clear winner to go in this new direction. But it is still, a challenge for folks to adjust to a new workflow.
Yeah. I like that way of thinking about it. If you were to flip it, no one would go the other direction. But that brings up a good point in that the new technology, the challenger in the equation always has the burden of proof in terms of,
Yep.
pushing people
It's like
against
it's got to
there.
be
And
10x better, right,
yeah,
in order to get that
exactly.
traction. Yeah.
Yeah. So that actually is a good segue into like, there's so many advantages, ROI wise, cost wise, future proofing, as you mentioned. But despite all that, there's still some resistance, and not just in fashion across verticals, but if we're focusing on fashion, we still
Mhm.
see some resistance. And what are you seeing there in terms of that resistance, and why do you think that is? Is it just typical fear of change and entrenched habits and risk aversion, and just sort of the standard list of points of resistance?
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, a lot of the traditional, all of the above apply, but I think specific to this category, there's kind of two main challenges. One is that the lack of understanding of what is 3D, to begin with, because there's a lot of, terminology out there. We've
Yeah.
probably seen those like 360 image spins, those have been around for a while where someone has a little turntable and a camera and it spins and it takes pictures. And then on the website, you can scroll it side to side and you get, different pictures from different angles. A lot of folks that we talk to, consider that 3D and they think, oh, is that what you need? You just want, the spin set. Or I go, no, 3D is an actual like model, right? Then you have to start getting technical and explaining that there's these triangles and polygons and textures that go, and you can change the lighting and you can, see the size. And so I think it's just a novel concept, right? And if you relate it to maybe, video games or movies, it's a little more relatable. But I think from a product photography standpoint, it's still relatively new. And
Yeah.
now AI has been introduced into the conversation too. So there's like potentially even more confusion around like
Yeah.
which technology does what and what outcome looks, realistic or fake. And over the years, a lot of the CGI, which is computer generated imagery, it has a range of quality. And just even think back to like movie experiences when Toy Story first came out, it looked amazing, and if you look at it again now, it looks dated, right? So
Yeah.
CGI has kind of had this way of like looking dated a few years out, and so maybe that's part of the hesitation too, is the
Yeah.
realism. It's there if you spend enough time and effort, but when it's that realistic, people don't know it's not a photograph. So that's where you
Yeah.
get this
Yeah.
dilemma of, oh, I've seen CGI because it looks fake, but you've also probably seen a lot of CGI that looks so realistic that you thought it was a photograph. And
Yeah.
so that's some of the dilemma, is selling people on CGI when they just think of what they associate
Yeah.
CGI with, which is kind of fake, and not necessarily where it's being used, in a lot of places across the board. So that's kind of the first point, is just the understanding and the knowledge that we're hopefully helping people pick up the more they tune into things like this, or other content that we're putting out at SuperDNA and at Kronos. But point number two is really the cost.
Okay.
If you were, again, to think of this backwards, and you had a budget allocated for product photography, and I'll just ballpark, I'll say on average it's $100 to get all the photos you need for a new product. That same $100 could be spent on 3D, and you'd actually probably get more content out of it, for dollar. But because it's a new process and you have an existing budget that's allocated here
Yeah.
to Photo Studio, and all the overhead that goes with that for warehousing and logistics and team members and everything else, it's harder to chip a piece of that budget out and say, oh, we're going to spend the same amount of money on a 3D workflow,
Yeah.
especially when it's not like proven. So if you were to take the whole budget and allocate it to 3D, then there would be a cost savings. But because we're trying to take a POC usually and say, like, let's take this category and do it here, it's seen more as an added expense. Like, oh, we have
Yeah.
to spend X amount of money to get 3D. And it's not necessarily seen as a savings, because that whole existing infrastructure is still there largely. And, you're basically just taking a small sliver out of that workflow, putting it through this new workflow, and all of a sudden now you have two things to manage. And
Yeah.
so from a cost perspective, it's time and it's money, and it's new. And so it's hard to do that switch. You can't just turn off your existing content production pipeline and process. You have to kind of like, build up your 3D technology. And we do try to help people go through that digital transformation. But, I think, those are the two biggest
Yeah.
barriers that I see, aside from the usual, resistance to change.
That makes a lot of sense, especially the like everyone's got to jump at once, in terms of just the
Mhm.
coordination of transitioning existing legacy processes into this new thing. And another thing that comes to mind is that it seems that some of the financial costs, when you're looking at the cost benefit analysis, as they always do, are sort of front loaded in not only just sort of the
Yeah.
initial 3D model generation, but also the learning curve. And it seems like the folks that have done this have committed to it, and the returns really start flowing after a little while, after they're tapping into sunk costs and amortizing that front end cost over a longer period. So given that sort of production life cycle, how should some of these fashion brands be thinking about that? How can they sort of take the first steps, and like you said, the digital transformation, how can they do it in ways that merge with their existing systems and processes so it's less intimidating?
Yeah, absolutely. And usually where we find that approach to start is identify maybe a new category, a new area, line, product segment that you want to, experiment with, or that you're willing
Okay.
to try something new, right? And so we'll usually do that kind of smaller proof of concept with a customer. We'll help them, run through the whole process. They'll get to understand what the challenges are, what the needs are, what the turnaround time looks like, and ultimately, they'll be able to compare that new process to the existing process.
Hmm.
And they should be able to make a pretty clear distinction and say, oh, actually, we were able to ship this a lot faster. We were able to get, better or just as good results that are more flexible. And then as a bonus, you get all these other new 3D things that, like,
Yeah.
I don't think people need to even think about right now. It's like, think about your 2D imagery or your video content, use that as your kind of like A B comparison. And then when you get that, you'll realize that, oh, there's all this bonus 3D stuff. We can do virtual try on, we can do configurators, we can do spins. I think initially when I was first getting into this space, 10 years ago, I was trying to jump to that 3D realization. And a lot of us in the industry have seen that and understood like, oh, this is so cool. Once you have 3D, you can do this, this, and this. But there's really this chicken and egg problem because you can't just turn over your entire front facing, web interface, let's say, or mobile app um, to a 3D thing unless you have 3D models for all your products. And most
And mobile
retailers,
optimized for that,
and they got to be optimized and they got
yeah.
to be looking good. So like it's hard to do at scale. And Wayfair is a pretty large retailer that had something like 10 million products. So when we were looking at this challenge and we were digitizing thousands upon thousands of products like every month, it was like, wow, we're making a lot of models. But then if you look at like the small percentage of everything we sell, it was like we're never going to be able to do that individually, right, as a retailer. And Amazon's taken a similar approach, right? They've digitized thousands of models every month through us and other partners to create this kind of experience for the end customer. But that experience is only enabled for a small fraction of all the things that you could buy. And so we're in this weird spot where that 3D experience is coming, and it's pretty great if you have it, but most products don't have it, and so most retailers don't push those experiences because then it looks like, oh, nothing, you don't sell anything, right? At Wayfair, it's like, oh, we could take our 100,000 3D models and create a room planning tool, and this we did a Magic Leap like demo where you could pull stuff together and stylize your space, and it's cool, but it's limiting compared to the it's like one if we had 100,000 products, it's like 1% of the 10
Yeah,
million products that we sold.
right.
And so until the brands actually start bringing 3D into the platforms and it becomes a requirement and an expectation, it's going to be hard to really push those 3D concepts like across the
Yeah,
board. However, brands, especially the luxury brands, we find they like that differentiation. They like that there's, only a few of them that offer these 3D configurations or experiences. So it helps kind of show that they're thought leaders, they're, you know, early adopters, they're exclusive. So there's some value to a brand standpoint having those extra 3D experiences. But I would say generally, to answer the original question, start with your 2D needs,
yep.
photography and videography, and use 3D to create that content. Compare the process, and you'll see that 3D is a lot more efficient. And in the end, it's going to save you money.
Yeah, and that makes sense to sort of incubate it within, one product category or something like that so they can get that benchmark. Now, another sort of stepping down the line, like say they've committed, they're interested in, adopting 3D and realizing all these benefits. There's yet another challenge that awaits them in the paradox of choice, right? I
Mhm.
mean, there's so many different vendors, not a lot of sort of transparency or clear-cut signals or benchmarks about, who's doing what and who's good. Like, what do you recommend that they look for at that stage?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And so I'd say, you want to start with that use case you identify. I mean, I was mentioning that, 2D imagery is a large spot. A lot of our customers start there. But it's not always the initial stepping stone. Sometimes you're looking for like a virtual try-on experience for your website, or you're looking for a configurator, or maybe you're looking for some, assembly instruction tool. We've found that we've been able to work with a lot of partners over the last, several years that do those end implementations,
Mm,
and where we've kind of kept our core focus is on the content production, because no matter what experience you're having, you need 3D content. And so working with a vendor like SuperDNA, we can help you navigate that path and connect you with the right experiences that you need. But the core, value prop that we bring is, transparency and a streamlined process in the content creation. So you get that, QA review tool that we provide for the web. You get the ability to link in different, APIs and content management systems so that your data flows into our system. Artists get that work done, and then you can review it, and it gets pushed and syndicated back out. So, of course, I got to plug around services, but there's a number of other, folks out there in the industry that are creating 3D content. And so, get started with a partner. If you find that, you're having challenges scaling, that's another area that you may end up coming to someone like SuperDNA later if scale is an issue. So,
yeah.
yeah, I'd say, find someone to get started with on a small subset, even if it's 5 or 10 products. get it out there, see the ROI for yourselves. And then once you make that commitment, we're here to help do the hundreds or thousands of products that you may have.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, which is AI. That's the elephant in the room. That's the hot
Uh-huh.
topic these days, obviously. But when we're talking about generative AI, it's sort of sitting next to all of this as another technology that sort of is disrupting any image based technologies and systems.
Yeah,
So
for
when
sure.
we're looking, yeah, when we're looking at 3D modeling and immersive shopping, how do you sort of separate those or delineate them whenever you see like client confusion between that and Gen AI? Or, what are some of the ways they even complement each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we have a product specifically internally we call AI CGI, and it's a pure 2D to 2D process. AI these days is really good at doing that kind of 2D to 2D
Yeah.
translation, right? You've probably seen in Photoshop, you can fill in the background, you can get it to, crop out things you might not want. And when it's up to manipulating individual pixels on like a 2D image or even video, we're seeing that AI is pretty increasingly capable of creating, imagery. And so we use it internally as a tool. Again, we call it AI CGI. It basically takes an input of like a silhouette or just a product. We can trim out the background too, but usually if it's just a white background silhouette, the customer is in need of more rich lifestyle in context imagery because that type of imagery sells better. And so AI can help fill the gap and literally fill the background and relight the product in a way that makes it feel authentic, right? It'll fill in the
Yeah.
shadows and it'll cast the light in the right spots. However, AI, when you just put it into like a system or just press a button or prompt a few things, it'll often get things wrong. And so
Yeah.
that's where we've kind of paired our internal stylists and designers with these AI enhanced tools so that for a customer, they can say, this is what I want, and we can turn it around faster at a lower cost than if we were to build a full 3D model in a full environment and traditionally render it with like a CGI process. The AI CGI will essentially take the 2D image. Our designers will build out a kind of brand story that matches the look and feel that you've shown across your website and all your branding and your customer messages, so that the AI imagery that we're generating is more on brand than if you were
Yeah.
just going to randomly put it into one of these kind of AI online tools.
Yeah.
But it still has issues. We go back and sometimes, we've seen like in an outdoor scene, like the little mat will have like grass coming through it. It's like, wait, why is there grass there?
Yeah.
Or I was viewing one yesterday. It was a doorway, and on the doorway it had like the hinges for the door, and then on the other side of the door there was another hinge, and I was like, well, why is there an extra third hinge over there? So AI will throw in some weird little stuff, and if you're not carefully looking for it, you might end up with an extra finger or something, right? So
Right.
there's the problem with AI is it's kind of hallucinating things.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's 2D AI, and I think it's fairly robust. Again, we have a solution for it, and it does help people get more rich 2D content today. It doesn't necessarily help with 3D, despite some things you might have seen in TechCrunch or whatever. Right? There's been
Right.
a string of promising startups, even since when I was at Wayfair, years back, like 6-7 years ago, they were trying to generate 3D models from like a single photograph or maybe a couple photographs. And those tools are still, I would say, in early stages of development. Depending on your use case, if you're trying to build out a simulation for self driving cars and you need a whole bunch of stuff and street signs and fire hydrants, and it doesn't have to represent a real product, some of these AI gen tools actually are pretty helpful, right? If you're building out just stuff that needs to look kind of close,
Yeah.
it can work. But when you're building your actual product, you need like a one-to-one, fully represented digital twin of the thing you sell. You can't just like hallucinate in parts of
Yeah.
the product that you don't have images for. So every time I hear someone say, "Oh, I can, generate your product with one photo," I'm immediately skeptical because,
Yeah.
what are you going to put on the backside, right? You're going to hallucinate something based on other products that might look similar, but then the customer gets it and it doesn't have the same, buttons or plugs that they might have expected from a 3D experience. You're setting yourself up for failure.
Yep.
And so while we might use some of those tools internally as like a starting point for a final 3D model, it still takes that kind of attention to detail that a human artist will put in to make sure all of those points are fully representative.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like Gen AI has sort of excelled at things that are imaginative and serendipitous, but not necessarily something that needs to precisely mirror a real product. And there's, brand safety and all kinds of issues like that. So that makes a lot of sense. And we've seen outside of this context, similar to what you're saying, using generative AI in the creative workflow as sort of a first step at prototyping of just
Yeah.
sort of imagining or storyboarding what a room might look like. And then once you get, oh, we want that, that's what we want. And then move forward with the methods that have greater precision and manual oversight. So that makes sense. It's still in the process, but not in the places that everyone thinks.
Yeah,
So
it's really I would just give one more use case
yeah.
that we have on the AI side that's been really helpful for our team for the last couple of years, and that's on a search basis, right? So we've made more than 250,000 3D models, and a lot of times you see the same types of products come back, right? So it's like if we can search the existing library, which can be hard to do in a traditional like 3D database, right? It's like you have to look by tag or you have to look by image, and you're manually scrolling through things. We've been able to basically train AI to do that image and component search for us.
Huh.
So we can identify from a reference photo of a new product a particular detail. Maybe it's the way the corner of the couch is tufted. Draw a little box around that, and then get all the 3D files that we've made in the past that have those matching
Huh.
details. And so that's really been a good time saver for us, because when the artist has a 3D model that's already built in a way that is optimized for the web, it has a good layout, it has good clean geometry. They can work from that and then morph it and match it to meet the new brand's product based on a similar one that we have in our library. So that's another
Very
great way
cool.
for us to save time and ultimately reduce cost.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, winding down here, so what are you sort of working on now that most excites you? Sort of looking forward, at least for the near term. What are the things that we can expect to see from Super DNA 3D Lab? At least the ones that you're allowed to talk about in terms of your sort of roadmap.
Yeah, now I think one of the interesting, big pushes that we've been seeing now is this kind of shift from the larger players, like an Amazon or a Wayfair, in creating the content for themselves to, put out an experience. We're seeing them shift that into empowering the brands to create and manage their own content and then
Hmm,
submit it, through a partner like us, and then get that content syndicated. So that's been great for us to work more closely directly with the brands, who ultimately should be the ones that own and, manage that 3D digital twin of their product,
yep.
and therefore they can get more ROI on it. Because if Amazon's building a model for you, most of the time these brands don't even know that there was a 3D model created of their product and that Amazon's using it in a cool new way, or there's some virtual try-on experience. Amazon hasn't always been great about telling the brand themselves, like, hey, we enabled this thing for you. And now we're seeing that they've gotten past the tipping point internally. They have enough content to make those features, feature now in the app, and something that people come to expect. Now they can go back to all the other brands, or the ones that they did a couple products for, and say, hey, now it's time for you to submit your full
Hmm,
digital catalog. These are all the things you can do. And, SuperDNA, or, some of the other partners they list, can help you with that digital transformation. So really this brand empowerment, I think, is
yeah.
is important. And I would say when I started my own startup in 2019, I had this conception that that's where the industry was then, 5 years ago. And it really wasn't. It's only getting to that
Yeah.
point now. I think internally at Wayfair, we had been, in a similar position where we were trying to push that out to brands to get them to digitize their own content. And there was so much, lack of understanding of what the process is, that's essentially what I started my company for, was to help brands kind of create that content so they could push it and syndicate it out to these platforms. But it turns out that we were kind of a little ahead of the curve there, and most other retailers weren't ready to ingest content yet. And so now the fact that, Amazon and Snap and Wayfair and Target and others are starting to ingest that 3D content, it gives brands more value and ROI. So if you're investing in the 3D model for Amazon, but you also sell across the web in an omni-channel marketplace, now that same 3D content is no longer owned by Amazon, it's owned by you, the brand, and
Yeah.
you can decide how and where you want to use it, whether it's on those retail channels or even on your own website or in advertising. Google supports 3D ads, Snapchat has virtual try on ads. So yeah, there's a lot of potential these days.
Yeah. And that makes sense to really sort of scale it because there's only so much Amazon can do from a centralized position. So to hit that really long tail of the,
Yep.
hundreds of thousands of FBA sellers that they have to put it in their hands makes a lot of sense. And I have sort of a theory about the sequence of adoption that we've seen in sort of past cycles, which is that you'll have, a few early adopter brands. You mentioned them already, some of the luxury brands that really want to differentiate with like a sort of tech forward experience they're offering their customers. You see that first, and
Yeah.
then the users, the consumers, start to get the taste in their mouth, right? And then that sort of develops gradually into an expectation. And then once that expectation reaches critical mass on the user end, then all of the brands that have not adopted it yet are sort of at a competitive disadvantage. And then at some point, there's a tipping point where it becomes table stakes that, you
Yeah.
basically
Yep.
have to. So it's almost like the carrot and the stick. The carrot is what attracts the early brands, but eventually the long tail is forced. I mean, I don't want to make it
Yes.
sound too forced is a strong word, but it seems like those market forces eventually sort of happen in that sequence.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's been a nice early adopter, phase, but it's been kind of stretched out longer than I think a lot of us in the industry
Right.
were expecting.
The
And
question's
now we're
when.
starting to finally see that push forward into the mass adoption.
Yeah, I think the question is when that tipping point comes. We know it's coming. The question's when, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a great place to end it. I want to thank you, Mike, for joining us.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you all for watching. This has been AR Insider Innovators. Our guest today was Mike Festa. You can find out more about Mike and SuperDNA 3D Lab in the links below. And you can read AR Insider daily insights and market coverage at arinsider.co. So please like, comment, and share if you liked this video. That helps others find us. So I'm Mike Boland. Thanks for watching and see you next time.